This video is an introduction to the elements of design. You will learn more about each individual element of design as we continue through the class. The elements of design are line, shape, form, space, mass, texture, and color. So we'll be talking about each of these as we go throughout this interior design class. You can think of this like tools. So when we're creating our designs, if we want it to be pleasing, we want people to enjoy it, we want it to be functional, the elements of design are some tools that we can use to make that happen. If we use them well in our design will turn out being the best possible design it can be. Line is our first element of design. So when we use line, it shows direction, it suggests movement. Line leads the eye. So if you want someone to look somewhere in your design, you can use line to draw their eye there. And that's one way designers do use this element of design. So it can influence how the viewer experiences that space. If you want a room to be larger or smaller, the type of line you choose can make that happen. So it can change how someone interacts with the room by using line correctly. In interior design, we use 4 different types of lines. So our first type of line that we use is a vertical line, which is a straight up and down line that is perpendicular to the ground. Our horizontal line, those are the ones that are parallel to the ground, so they follow the horizon line. Then we can have our curved lines, and then a diagonal line, which are angles between the vertical and the horizontal. So each of these types of line causes a different effect or a different feeling when we use it in design. So we can choose what we want to represent, and we'll choose a line to match that. Our next element of design is shape. Shapes have height and width, but they don't have any depth. So they're two-dimensional. A shape is flat. They can be geometric, so coming from kind of math designs, or they can be more organic and freeform. So if I made a flower shape, that would be a more free form. But if I'm looking at a square or a circle, that's more of our geometric shape. They don't have any depth to them. They're flat. We don't use them as often in interior design. We're more likely to use the next element of design. Our next element of design is form. So forms have height, width, and depth. So they add that three-dimensional aspect. They're going to occupy space. They have the depth that shape doesn't. So often when we're describing something, we might call it a shape when it would be more accurate to use the word form. So for example, if a shape is a circle, then if we have a sphere like a ball, that would be a form. If a triangle is our shape, the form is a pyramid. And if a square is our shape, our form would be a cube or a box. So they're going to take up more space. So when we put furniture into a room, that's an example of a form we're using in interior design. So it's going to go into the room, it's going to take up space, it's going to have height, width, and depth. So it's more three-dimensional. Space is the next element of design, and there's 2 ways we can think about space. So the first way to think about space, we can think of the space as being the area inside of a form. So an example of this is when we have an empty room. The empty room itself is the form, and now we could put something else into it. So in an empty room, we could load some furniture into it. So it has space available to be filled up by the furniture. So if I were to put a chair into my empty room, now we've got some furniture in there. We filled the space. The second way to think about space is we can think about space as the open area around a form. So an example of that is once the piece of furniture goes into the room, the form, and it has empty space around it. So the furniture is taking up some space, but there's no more space available around the furniture. So in the second picture over here, we've got our empty room, we've got a chair and a table into it. Now those pieces of furniture, they're taking up space, but we still have more space around it. So it can be either of these 2 things, the first way or the second way. They're both types of space. When we're thinking about space in interior design, we're thinking about how we can change something or add something to it. So the size and arrangement of a space, it can change the way a viewer feels in the room. So depending on what you put into a room, how much of it you put in there, how much space there is to move around, you're going to have a different experience in that room. And when we place a form into a room, that's called the positive space. So if we take a couch and we put it into an empty room, the couch is now positive space. All the rest of the empty room around that couch, that's what we call the negative space. So we can think of space as both positive and negative. The positive is the piece of furniture we put into the room, and then the space that's left around that piece of furniture, we can call that our negative space. The element of design mass is the amount of pattern, color, texture, fabric, materials, or size that are part of a form. So when we look at a form like a piece of furniture, it can have different mass depending on how it's put together. So we have two chairs on this slide here, the blue chair and this white chair. They're probably both similar size. They're kind of similar shape. They're a very similar type of piece of furniture, but they're going to have a different mass because of the color that's used. The darker blue will change the mass versus this white colored chair. Mass can also be thought of how crowded or empty a space appears. So how many forms get included into a space. So down in our pictures here, this first space has a lot of things added into it. A lot of furniture, a lot of accessories, a lot of paintings. So it's going to have a little more mass than something that has less in it. So our second picture, we just have a very small minimal amount of furniture. That's going to have a different type of mass than the first picture. Same thing in this last picture here. It's got tons of things. It's completely stuffed into the room. So we can change the mass of something, and we call that high or low mass, which we'll learn a little bit more about on the next slide. So a space or a form, it can have high or low mass. So when we think of a form like a chair with high mass, it's probably going to have lots of patterns and lines. It's going to have darker colors. It's going to have heavy materials and be more closed in. When we think of something having low mass, it's probably going to be more simple, less pattern and line, lighter colors, smaller and simpler materials, and more open. If we think of a space having mass, if a space is completely filled with furniture and accessories and all sorts of items, it's going to have a higher mass. If it's more open, it has less in it, it's more open space, we're going to have lower mass. So if we look at the pictures on this slide, we have two chairs here. We have this light colored chair and then one that's a little bit darker. So between these two chairs, this first chair, it's going to have more of a low mass. It's more simple, it has less pattern, it has less color, it's lighter, it's more open, so it's not completely closed in. We can use that for lower mass. Our second chair, it's got a closed in back, it's got pattern, it's got color, the colors are darker, it's got more fabric. So even if those chairs, they're both dining chairs, are the same size, the second one's going to have more mass in the room. It's going to be higher mass than the first one. If you look at the last picture, it shows some examples of mass. So starting on the first side, it's starting with lowest mass and moving over to highest mass for each of these pieces of furniture. So if you look at this chair, they're probably going to take up about the same amount of space in the room. They're probably about the same size. But this first chair, notice how it's more open on the bottom. It's a little bit smaller on the arms. It's going to have a lower mass. This next one, it comes a little closer down to the ground. So it's got more filled in. It's a little more rounded in the shape. It's going to have higher mass. And then this last one out of the three chairs has the most mass. It's got a skirt on the bottom, so it's completely covered with fabric to the bottom. And our arms are even more rounded. So it kind of changes as it moves along. It goes from a lower mass to a higher mass. Same thing with the tables on the bottom. The first table is very light, it's very open, isn't very closed in, very light materials. The next table is kind of a medium mass, it's a little darker materials, but still pretty open. And then the last one is going to be a much higher mass because it's closed in and it's got dark material. So we can use mass to kind of change what we call the visual weight of a room. So how your eye sees it. Things with higher mass are going to have more visual weight. You're going to notice it more than you do something with lower mass. And we can use that in design. So texture is the surface quality of an object. So it's either the way it feels or appears to feel. Depending on how it feels or appears to feel, it's two different types of texture. So our first type of texture is our tactile texture. So that's the way the surface actually feels to the touch. This texture, you can see it and feel it, and they're going to match. So if you have a stone wall or the bark on a tree, it's going to look like it's rough, and if you go up and touch it, it's going to feel rough. That's tactile texture. Our second type of texture is visual texture. So that's texture you can see, but you can't always feel it. This is more the appearance of the texture. So most time you can tell what a texture is going to look like before you touch it, but there's sometimes texture will fool your eye, and that's usually an example of visual texture. So for example, if we had a bark pattern wallpaper or a picture of bark on a tree, it might look rough, but it's really going to have a smooth texture. If you actually touched it in real life, it would have smooth texture. So it has a visual texture. You see that rough texture, but you might not actually have the same tactile touch texture with it. So it's more likely to kind of trick the eye, fool the eye a little bit. It looks like it should have texture, but it doesn't actually have that same texture in most cases. Our last element of design is color. So colors are really our most significant element in design. We use it heavily all the time. Anytime you're making any kind of design, color is going to be involved. And color gets produced when light strikes an object and then it gets reflected back to the eye. So depending on how much wavelength gets reflected back to the eye, that's the color you see. So when we use color in design, you can set a mood, you can make a feeling, you can change the way people experience the room. So we use color all the time in design.